This is the award-winning real estate recruitment company Madison Berkeley's Empower Equity Campaign Reverse Mentoring Sessions. We are supported by the industry networking organisation Ladies in Real Estate. This week, each day, we will publish a session involving a junior female in the industry, reverse mentoring a senior female in our industry. The aim of the Empower Equity campaign is to address the issue of female retention within our industry. Historically, the representation of women has been very low at around 13% for many years. The good news is that figure has gone up dramatically, and the work being done around EDI is starting to pay off. However, the latest figures from the Real Estate Balance Industry Survey 2022, released in February, found that at board level within the sector, female representation in our industry is running at around 29%, and at senior and leadership level, it's around 27%. Retention is clearly the issue. Each female partnership in these Empower Equity campaign sessions will aim to start conversations surrounding the issues causing this lack of retention. And the hope is that by opening these discussions, change may be effected and more females will remain in our industry at senior and leadership level. Now it's time to hand over to the junior female and senior female taking part in today's session. I'm going to let them introduce themselves.
Thank you very much, Lucy, for your introduction. I'm Jessica too. I work at Cushman and Wakefield, and I've been qualified for about a year and a half as a senior surveyor. I came straight out of university and started working at Cushman and Wakefield from the graduate scheme up until now.
Nice to meet you, Jess. I'm Anthea Harries. I'm Asset Management Director at Argent. I am responsible for the King's Cross development and the Related Argent projects. I have been doing this quite a bit longer than you, 25 years, which is quite scary when you say it out loud. And I've been chartered for over 20 years. Been in this industry a long time and intend to carry on, which is great.
Absolutely incredible. I did look at a little bit at your history and I was absolutely amazed at some of the things that you've covered. So just as a very brief introduction, there's going to be 5 main topics which I really wanted to ask you about. So we'll be covering the definition of diversity and inclusion, D&I as a journey, tokenism, measuring inclusion, and then your final overall thoughts. So I pose to start off with the definition. What does diversity really mean to you, and how would you define diversity?
That's a really interesting question because you'd get a different answer from any individual you would ask, but all around the same theme. And for me, it's about anybody having equal opportunity to do what they would like to do and having the opportunity to do that, no matter their social economic background, their race, their gender, their colour, their political orientation or sexual orientation. And it's very important to me personally and professionally that no matter what industry you want to go into, or indeed whatever you would like to try and attempt in your life, at your wish, that we're able to accommodate and facilitate that for anybody from any background.
I completely agree with you. It's all very much about that whole opportunity, as you mentioned. Having said that, I suppose if we get straight to the crux of the issue, why do you think there is such a low retention rate of women in real estate, especially at higher levels?
I think maybe we'll start slightly earlier than that. I mean, I remember going to university and I chose to do a real estate degree in Newcastle, and I think I was one of 5 women on a course of 120 men. I have to say, even going back all those years, so nearly 30 years, there wasn't anything stopping me doing that. I certainly didn't feel that way as I was coming out of school into my A-levels and into university. However, I think there was a lack of awareness, and I think we need to start there. That's an important point. In order to get women specifically, or anyone from any background, into a real estate job, you have to actually be aware of the opportunity in our profession in the first place. So if we can bring more diverse people into the industry, and perhaps we'll touch on later on the restrictions around how that can actually happen, then you have a considerably greater chance of keeping people in the industry that they have intentionally set out to try and enter. I think the challenges on the way, of which I felt myself, and I'm happy to talk about, are managing a family, being able to work within this industry and juggle family life is really difficult. I brought up 4 children. My youngest is 15. And that was incredibly difficult at times, particularly if you only look back a decade where the opportunity to work part-time or flexibly basically did not exist, certainly not for women in my view. But I think importantly, there are other challenges as well, and that's perhaps around this very old school traditional real estate view on the type of sectors that women traditionally have worked in, i.e. The professional sector or valuation, or more sort of academic parts of the industry versus the ability to perhaps get out in the field. So to me, I think there's 2 issues primarily. It's getting women into the industry in the first place because they need an awareness of it, and particularly the diversity of opportunity in real estate. And secondly, it's retaining them, partly because of the challenges we face just being women and a family dynamic, but also the onus has to be on businesses and industry now to really nurture and support people through their careers. And I think that we are in a different place on, and I'm happy to discuss that further.
I absolutely agree with you. One thing that I think is very interesting to see is the differences in perspective between people in the industry. So I'm very fortunate that I have an incredible line manager, and she's absolutely amazing. She's so incredibly supportive. And I have also asked her about these sorts of issues, and she mentioned the childcare being a major issue. But hearing some of the stories from when she first started compared to now, I genuinely can't fathom working in some of the environments that like I'm aware that some women have worked in, and I don't even know how to describe it. I genuinely wouldn't be able to work, I suppose, like that.
Yeah, the pressure's huge, and it's not just financial. You know, if you choose to work, if you choose to stay at home and bring up your children, that's a job in itself, for sure. I chose to go back to work after having both my biological children. I had 2 stepchildren as well that were older and lived with us full time. And financially, it was just so demoralizing because I was getting out of bed and going to work for no money. In fact, I was in sort of negative equity territory because it was so expensive to put my children in childcare. And then not only that, I never really felt like I was doing a great job. I was always trying to get that balance of feeling guilty because I wasn't there to drop off or pick up. I always had to, put the pressure of that on my husband or other members of the family, and then equally never feeling like I was giving my 100% best at work. It's a very, very difficult dynamic, but I think it's important first and foremost that as a woman in this industry that you make the decision on what is best for you and your family. And I think that's a fundamental shift that has changed, where businesses are genuinely supportive of trying to get that balance right.
Absolutely, because I know that while I personally haven't had this experience, obviously, given my age, but I know that a lot of senior women in the industry have struggled with almost imposter syndrome and trying to balance everything. And it's quite interesting how there's always a lot of pressure on the woman, on the mother of the family, to be looking after their children. Whereas when men, I suppose, take that on themselves, even just the way that I phrased it, it's almost seen as an achievement for them. And it's really interesting trying to persuade people to shift their mentalities towards equal partnership.
Yeah, and I think the change in paternity laws has helped the perception of that balance shift, I think. And certainly the men that I work with who have chosen to take longer paternity leave don't see it as something they're either obliged to do or something that is an achievement in itself. They genuinely see it as a partnership. I suspect that's not the case across the board. And that's going to take time. We are in a period of transition. And I think we've made, some very positive inroads, but there's still clearly a huge amount more to do. I think the pandemic has also catapulted the opportunity for more flexible and agile working. That has helped. Certainly at Argent, we have a flexible, dynamic working policy. And fundamentally, it comes down to trust. If you have an employer that trusts in the capability and the capacity and the work ethic of their staff, then you really should be able to manage your job in a way that suits you, as long as it doesn't impact on your customers, your occupiers, your clients, your investors, whomever you're reporting to and responsible to provide for. That has, I think, catapulted us 10 years further on than perhaps we were before the pandemic, where I personally still felt under a lot of pressure to do those long hours, and I still do those long hours, but I do it in a slightly more flexible way.
Moving on to D&I as a journey, it's obviously not an issue specific to real estate, but across all sectors.
Yes.
How do you think property compares to other industries?
I think we're probably behind the curve, if I'm honest. As I say, I think, you know, I don't want to beat it up too much, but I think we are behind the curve. And I think that starts at grassroots level, which is what I talked about at the very beginning, that fundamentally, and it's great to see you, Jess, come through university and make a decision to move into real estate. But unless we're educating children at a younger age, year 7, year 8, year 9, about the opportunities in real estate, then often what's happening, I've seen it with my own children, they'll focus on what they know or what their friends do or what their friends' parents do. You're often sort of driven into avenues, into professions or into areas of interest that you know and you can see. So I think it is really, really important that we as an industry embed the opportunities within real estate at a young age, at grassroots level, and that there is more opportunities to enter the profession rather than just doing a traditional either cognate degree or non-cognate degree and the associated routes. We haven't got enough apprenticeships. We haven't got enough opportunities to work on the job and then train on the job, either doing a degree or otherwise. We're certainly not connected enough to children in poorer backgrounds, still very much seen as a sort of slightly elitist profession, I think, and one that is linked around nepotism, and we need to change that perception. So that, I think, is an area of focus that all businesses within real estate and particularly the bodies, and I sat on the board at the RICS for 3 years, need to focus on driving this industry and the awareness to get younger people to even be aware of, you know, the 140 different types of surveying that you can actually do. But I think as an industry, we are behind the curve, but that curve has sort of, you know, plodded along the bottom for many, many years. And suddenly we are seeing an uptick. Certainly when I've given tours to university students, you know, on most of those courses, they're now 50-50. That was not the case 20 years ago. So it's great to see, but it's incumbent on the senior management in a business, the owners and the leadership groups within a business to really be driving this for it to be effective.
Yes, I was just about to say this. It's funny because at my university course, there were more women than men. And I didn't necessarily notice at the time, but I did definitely feel very comfortable in that environment. However, having said that, I agree with what you said about broader diversity. I definitely think that the majority of the people that enter into the real estate industry are people that have had previous connections,
yes,
most likely through parents or perhaps like senior members of their family. Because at the end of the day as well, I didn't really know that this was a profession until my parents mentioned it to me, full disclosure. But without that, I don't think I'd have ever probably gone that. I would have, as you mentioned, gone down a very traditional route of perhaps like being a lawyer or like finance or something like that. But as some interesting statistics, which I've pulled up from the ONS, the gender pay gap in theory has been declining over time. And in 2022, the gap was 9.4%. Out of 16 reported sectors, I'm just curious, where do you think real estate falls on that spectrum? Do you think it's worse or better?
I think it's probably better than that.
So we are the 6th worst in terms of pay gap because we have a pay gap difference of 12%.
Really? Wow.
Yes, which is pretty bad. Having said that, the worst sector is finance and insurance with a median pay gap of 25.4%, which is absolutely abysmal.
It really is. And the challenge we have in our sector, I suppose I'm trying to take a broad view when we're talking about this topic, is that it's very hard to compare a female and a male in what they do, because often everybody's roles in a business, you'll see it in Cushman's, is very diverse. You could be sitting opposite a surveyor who's a year and a half qualified, but maybe working in a different area of specialism to you, which then when you mark their salary to market, may be either higher or lower than yours. So we need to be making sure that when we're looking at analytics across the industry, we are genuinely comparing apples with apples and not apples and pears.
Yeah.
And I think, that is shocking, to be honest. I personally, as in a senior management role where I have visibility and transparency over people's salaries and remuneration, I haven't seen that for some years now, certainly not in the businesses that I've worked in. So let's be honest, if you're in development, often that's paid more highly than asset management. If you're in property management versus agency, you're paid in a different way, often whether that's base salaries or bonus related versus base salary. If you're looking at providing rating advice and valuation advice versus actually looking at professional rent review type work, you might find there's more similarities across the type of pay that those individuals are getting. What is important, I think, though, rather than just looking at sort of the gender pay gap, which I suspect in that case was based on perhaps base salary or base salary and turnover, is the wider total contribution, the wider total package that individual is receiving. And I think the difference now that many industries are focused on, particularly for women, is giving them that flexibility. That has a value, giving them the opportunity to work in an agile way, supporting them with their childcare, looking at better maternity cover, looking at better paternity cover, looking at the healthcare that's offered for them and their family. They all have a value. So when you look at gender pay gap, in my view, and I'm not in the HR team, so that they may be shouting at me if I was sitting in the office talking about this. I think it is important that you look at the total contribution a business is giving you, because it has value. Every element of it has value.
And then you also mentioned about flexibility and how that's changed since COVID.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, because you have had an incredible career, I think starting off at British Land and then managing St. James at the Crown Estate, and now as the Asset Management Director of King's Cross for Argent. Yeah. But what sort of changes, including the whole flexibility thing, have you noticed from when you started work compared to now?
I think the expectation of being visible all the time. Often, if I was honest, and this is not linked to British Land or any other firm, it was perhaps a pressure I put on myself, or maybe not. Was this just, you've got to be in before the boss and you leave after the boss, and you do that 5 days a week, and you're expected to attend every single event. You're expected to travel. You're expected to basically put your work first and foremost, and everything else secondary to that. That, I think, was my experience when I was younger. Maybe self pressure, because I was very ambitious. I did want to work hard. I do think you have to work hard. I think there is a fine balance between taking things for granted versus what a business expects from you as a young professional. But that was very challenging at times, particularly when I had young children. And I remember being nervous about asking if I could do one day at home, and nervous coming out of my first maternity leave, going into my second maternity leave. I had my children about 2 years apart, to ask if I could work 4 days a week rather than 5. And I was nervous about that. I didn't assume it was going to be a given. I assumed that I would really have to work hard to try and convince them that I could still do my job. And the other challenge is, and I still think this is unfortunately happens, is that where you do work part-time for whatever purpose, caring responsibilities or a family or other, often you end up still doing a 5-day-a-week job in 4 days and being paid 4 days a week. And that's quite difficult. And I've seen many, many women in my career that, have been in my teams and worked across other businesses that I've supported and mentor, struggle with that concept that they are still working a full-time job but only being paid for 4 days a week. That's still an issue, I think. But I do think, the expectation around being in the office 5 days a week, spending 2-3 hours a day traveling, not being able to pick your children up from nursery until it shuts, having the ability to take time to be with your children if they're unwell, or if you're unwell, not feeling that pressure of having to race to work to be seen. That presenteeism, I think, has disappeared in most businesses. So all of those things have changed. I wouldn't say they're all fully rounded or all sort of cemented in day-to-day working practices. And obviously businesses are different. You might find some of the larger, more established business with higher staff numbers may be very different to a smaller business where you've only got 5 people in the office and you all need to be there. So I think it does depend on the type of business, but I do think we are in a better place. I certainly believe that we are. And I think it's about being open and transparent as a member of staff with your line manager, with the head of the team, being open about where you need support or where you need flexibility. And more often than not, as long as it doesn't impact the business, they will support you. If it does impact the business, then as an individual, you have to understand why they perhaps may say no.
And then moving on to tokenism, this is an issue that I particularly wanted to raise. So in simple terms, it's the practice of doing something only to give the appearance that people are being treated fairly and to prevent criticism. Have you seen this or come across this issue before?
Yes, unfortunately. And I still think it feels real still. And in some ways it's very obvious, and that's the worst part of it. It does feel that way. I think businesses are still trying to grapple with doing the right thing, but doing it in a robust, transparent and comprehensive way to avoid this tokenism issue. If you think about it, we see that in every part of life. And so to see it in our industry between an employer and employee, or whether it's inviting people to come and talk. I mean, I despise being invited to go and speak on a panel because they want a female voice. I'd rather be speaking on a panel because I know what I'm talking about. And I feel the same about boards, to be honest, or any sort of senior management. I think there is an element whereby you have to have the experience to be able to sit at that level. You shouldn't be promoted beyond your means either, because that adds pressure. You know, that I've seen a lot of women also sort of being very ambitious and try to move in their careers quickly, but also struggled with the anxiety and the stress that goes with that. So I'm not a fan of tokenism. I believe it's wrong because people will, either the business or the individual, become unstuck, and that's distressful for everybody. But I think, unfortunately, it is still very relevant in our industry and indeed across society as a whole.
I absolutely agree. And I think one of the biggest difficulties is that it's not always intentional, and that in some cases companies can be doing their best to be coming from a good place. However, in reality, it doesn't really help anyone. But what I do find is that it tends to help in terms of measuring statistics. And I think on a broader note, measuring inclusion can be quite difficult. And I know you mentioned earlier that you weren't a fan of the gender pay gap, but what sort of broader metrics or indicators do you think could help assess diversity within the real estate industry?
That's a really good question, and measurement across many parts of our industry is very difficult. So if you take social value, you know, and the work that many developers and owners are doing around trying to connect with communities and enable the curiosity and capacity of others, that's very difficult to measure. And I think so is diversity and inclusion. And I'm no expert on what those measurement frameworks are or should be, but they should definitely be quantitative and qualitative, so that not only are you looking at the way people feel in a business or in an industry, but you're also looking at hard facts. And you have to start somewhere. So you have to get that base position right about how you're recruiting people, how you're employing people into the business, and how you're looking at growth and professional opportunities within your business, how you're looking at when people are leaving and why they're leaving, and then how you're going through a recruitment process. All of those things you can put tangible facts to. And I think it's incumbent now on every business to start to look at that data. And interesting, I was looking at the Harvard Business School did an article on exactly this, and there are 1,600 CEOs across the world that have signed up to the Action for D&I pledge, which is around a measurement tool, and there are 7 specific measurement frameworks that they need to start to look at, and some are qualitative and some are quantitative. So I think it's going to take time, and maybe the RICS, as our sort of body representing this industry, could look at trying to perhaps create a framework or working with industry leaders to do so, because half of the problem with any framework or measurement tool is consistency. So you've got to be able to compare like for like across different parts of the industry. question mark whether they should be looking at that. But it's very difficult to measure. But I think it's important that you set your stall out, you draw a line in the sand, you have the absolute facts on your own staff, you are open and transparent about how you're going about recruitment, and you can then start to measure success from there and be open and transparent about it.
Oh, absolutely. Particularly when you mentioned about talking to staff, I definitely believe that sort of individual employee feedback is absolutely crucial. But I think it's very important that companies need to recognize that any sort of feedback isn't intended to attack the company, but you can definitely use that as a starting point as improvement. Because I think from my perspective, my concern has always been that if I make particular comments, I don't know where it's going to end up or what's going to happen to it. But I think that only sort of stops any sort of potential change happening. And I think it's really crucial that companies communicate that this won't be taken in any sort of way. And at the end of the day, this is all meant to be positive and good for change.
Any constructive criticism is positive criticism, but it's got to be constructive, often not personal. And, the businesses are able to do that by keeping things anonymous. That's probably the best way to do it, to make sure that everybody can feel engaged and can ask the right question. It also does come back to the relationship you have with your line manager or your team manager, and being able to build that trust and that professional relationship where you can speak openly. The majority of people I've met in a senior management position genuinely have the best intentions of their staff. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in that position. It's not just about the work. With more complex and high profile work comes inevitably the need to have specialist people in your team. And in my case, I have a team of 26 people. And I would like to think that all of them could come and talk to me if they had an issue around D&I or any other issue, indeed. And that comes with training. So businesses have to train senior management staff to be able to be good leaders, but also to be good collaborators and team players.
Yeah, definitely. Just as much as you mentioned, I think that the broader workplace culture is absolutely changing. I also feel very comfortable and confident to be able to go to my line manager with any sort of problems. And I feel pretty confident I could say that across the business. And I think that's one change that's started to happen. But I suppose as an overall summarizing thought, what are some things that you think the real estate industry could do to change and improve?
I do think it's important, as I've touched on a couple of times, to be able to talk to children from all backgrounds, particularly poor parts of the UK and in more challenging, diverse communities, about the opportunities in real estate. It's incumbent on our institutional bodies to work with the education department to look at how we can be more agile around getting people into this industry. You have to have a certain level of intelligence, let's be honest about that. But there are other ways of getting people to where they need to be to catapult them into that industry. So I think education is critical. Awareness and communication is absolutely critical. And then I think once you're there, assuming we continue on that trajectory of bringing more diverse people into our industry, it's about businesses listening, adapting, being open and transparent with their staff, talking openly about what they can and they can't do, and building a more collaborative partnership relationship between the employer and the employee.
Thank you very much. It has been an absolute pleasure interviewing you, Anthea. I've been very honoured to have this opportunity.
It's lovely for you to say, Jess. I'm honoured to talk to you, and congratulations on your role, and I'm sure you'll be a huge success and an advocate for what we're talking about today.
And I'd like to say thank you both for taking part in Empower Equity reverse mentoring sessions. And obviously, please do share the sessions with all of your networks when the time comes. The more we open up the conversation of female retention, the more likely, I believe, we will see change. And yet, the Madison Berkeley Empower Equity campaign reverse mentoring sessions are supported by industry network organisation Ladies in Real Estate, and that's important to say. It's been an absolute pleasure listening to this session. Thank you very much.